They lied to you, not by accident, not by omission, but with intent. They told you Africa was waiting to be discovered, as if the continent had no past, no maps, no sails, no thought of the stars. They handed you a textbook. In it, history began in 1492. The rest of the world was drawn in the margins, unnamed, unexplained, unworthy. But Africa was never a footnote. It was the beginning. While Europe feared dragons at the edge of the ocean, Africa had charted the skies. While kings in cold castles debated borders, African scholars in Timbuktu debated the weight of the soul, the shape of the cosmos, and the ethics of trade. While Renaissance painters sketched angels in cathedrals, Malian emperors launched fleets westward, chasing knowledge beyond the horizon. This isn't speculation. This is evidence, buried under centuries of silence, sealed in libraries of mud brick and gold leaf, ignored by a world that preferred Africa conquered, not remembered. So we ask again, why did they lie? Because maps are power. Because stories shape empires. Because if you erase the navigator, you own the sea. And if you erase the scholar, you control the truth. They lied because Africa was the mirror they couldn't face, a reflection of genius, not savagery. A continent of scientists, astronomers, philosophers, shipbuilders, who knew the world long before the world was told it had begun. The lie was simple. Africa had no history. The truth is deeper. Africa was history. Long before the chains, there were manuscripts, over 700,000 pages, handwritten in Arabic and Ajami, covering law, astronomy, medicine, poetry, and theology. Before the sails of Spain touched Caribbean shores, the wind had already carried African thought across oceans. Before the plunder of people and gold, there was gold traded freely, measured by weight and wisdom. The West taught you to look at Africa through a narrow lens: war, poverty, dependence. But tilt the frame, and the full picture emerges. Vast libraries beneath desert sands, empires that mapped the stars, queens who spoke 7 languages, kings who launched navies not for conquest, but for curiosity. They told you Columbus discovered the world, but they never showed you the maps that predated him. They never mentioned al-Umari's records of a Malian emperor who stepped down from power to sail west, with 2,000 ships. They never taught you that the currents from West Africa lead straight to South America. Not by luck, but by oceanographic science Africans understood. What they gave you was a timeline made of chains. What we offer is a timeline made of truth. Africa's story does not begin in slavery. It begins in sovereignty. Let that word echo. Sovereignty. Over land, over law, over language, over legacy. They blurred the borders of Africa to fit their conquest. We redraw them in ink, manuscript by manuscript, memory by memory. They painted Cleopatra in pale colors, and history followed their brush. They carved her face into statues with broken noses. They rewrote her lineage to distance her from the Nile. Why? Because a queen who outwitted Rome, who mastered diplomacy and astronomy, could not remain African in their narrative. She had to be other. They erased her as they erased so many. But scrolls remember, maps remember, the wind remembers, so do we. They replaced Mansa Musa's gold with silence. They turned Abu Bakr II's fleet into myth. They labeled Timbuktu a joke instead of a jewel. They left Estevanico's name out of textbooks, even as he became the first African to set foot across the American Southwest. They lied to you, not just by hiding facts, but by hiding the framework that gives facts meaning. Because once you see Africa not as discovered, but as discovering, not as colonized, but as cosmopolitan, the entire scaffolding of Eurocentric history trembles. And here's the catch. This isn't about blame. This is about balance. History without Africa is not just incomplete. It is incorrect. And that correction begins now. And yet we are told to move on, to let go of the past. But how can you let go of a story you were never allowed to hold? This is not about nostalgia. It is about reclamation. It is about restoring what was buried, with evidence, with honor, with urgency. Because when you silence a civilization, you silence a future, and Africa's future is tied to its memory. So before we move further, we must return, not to grief, but to truth. This is not a myth. It's hidden African history. The lie ends here. We begin again, not in 1492, but in the libraries of Timbuktu, on the currents of the Canary Drift, under the gold-domed palaces of Mali, in the eyes of Cleopatra, and the sails of Abu Bakr. This is not the history they gave you. This is the history Africa wrote, and the world forgot. Now it is time to remember. History didn't forget Africa. It was taught to overlook, to underestimate, to unlearn. In Western classrooms, Africa appears as a void, a blank continent waiting for ships to arrive, waiting for names to be given, waiting for civilization. But what if the center of knowledge was never in Europe at all? Let us reframe the map, shift the gaze southward, and begin not with darkness but with light. In the ancient Nile Valley, long before the pyramids were romanticized into tourist symbols, a civilizational engine thrived. Kemet, land of black soil and black wisdom. A place where mathematics aligned temples with the stars, where priest-scientists tracked the flood of the Nile with lunar precision, where knowledge was sacred and power was intellectual. Further south, along the spine of the African continent, the kingdom of Kush rose, not in Egypt's shadow, but in its echo. Nubian kings once ruled Egypt itself, crowned as pharaohs in Thebes, building pyramids not for spectacle, but for continuity. They fused belief with astronomy, ritual with reason. And across the vast Sahel, beyond the deserts feared by outsiders, another empire shimmered. Mali. Mali was not a myth. It was a machine of trade, of ideas, of memory. Gold flowed like rivers, but the true wealth of Mali was not in metal. It was in manuscripts. In its golden age, the city of Timbuktu boasted over 150 schools, 180 Quranic institutions, and 3 major universities. The crown jewel was Sankore, not a European-style lecture hall, but an open-air marvel where debate was worship, and libraries held more volumes than most of Europe combined. The walls of Sankore did not echo with superstition. They rang with astronomy, medicine, logic, jurisprudence, poetry, and ethics. In Timbuktu, scholars developed mathematical methods to determine prayer times with astounding accuracy. Astronomers charted the movement of Venus and Jupiter. Jurists debated trade contracts across borders. Philosophers explored metaphysics, writing in layered Arabic that challenged even the best grammarians of Cairo or Damascus. These were not fragments of borrowed knowledge. They were contributions, original, critical, peer-reviewed by oral councils and written tradition. So how did the world come to forget? Because colonialism didn't just conquer land, it conquered epistemology, the right to define what knowledge is and who gets to create it. The French burned libraries during their invasion of Mali. Portuguese explorers ignored the schools of West Africa, focusing only on ports and plunder. English historians dismissed manuscript culture as primitive scribbles, even when faced with 1,000-page treatises on legal philosophy and astronomy. But the scrolls survived, wrapped in goatskin, hidden in mud walls, passed down through generations like sacred breath. Today, over 700,000 manuscripts remain, many yet to be translated. Some date back to the 11th century. Some still bear the fingerprints of their authors, imprints of ink, sealed with breath and belief. And this isn't limited to Mali. In Ethiopia, at the monastic libraries of Lalibela and Aksum, texts on medicine, metallurgy, and theology remain preserved in Ge'ez, a language older than Latin. In Central Africa, oral historians, griots, and bards kept dynastic records stretching back centuries, encoded in rhythm and repetition, long before paper arrived. In Zimbabwe, the stone walls of Great Zimbabwe whisper of an architectural mind often denied to pre-colonial peoples. The city had towers, trading quarters, and diplomatic infrastructure. Its economy was based on gold and cattle, not tribute but trade. All across the continent, a different image of Africa emerges, not peripheral, not passive, but central. Central to trade, central to science, central to the making of the world. Salt caravans crossed the Sahara from Tagaza to Walata. Ivory, copper, cola nuts, and manuscripts flowed along networks more complex than the Silk Road. African merchants negotiated in multiple currencies, cowries, dinars, dirhams, fluent in language, religion, and contract law. Mali's court entertained embassies from Morocco, Egypt, and Andalusia. Diplomats wrote in Arabic, Wolof, Soninka, and sometimes Latin. This was not a continent in isolation. This was globalization before the word existed, and yet the textbooks stayed silent. Europe did not invent the world. It joined it late. Let's be clear, this is not a denial of Europe's contributions. It is a refusal to erase Africa's. Civilization was never a torch passed from Greece to Rome to London. It was a bonfire, lit in many places at many times, and Africa's flame burned bright, not in defiance of Europe, but in defiance of erasure. Imagine if every child, from Lagos to London, learned that the world's first full-length university system, one that graduated thousands, existed in Timbuktu. Imagine if they were told that medieval African cities had sewage systems, astronomical observatories, and tax documentation. Imagine if they knew that primitive masks were encoded with fractal geometry long before Benoit Mandelbrot gave the West a word for it. This isn't imagination. This is history. And history isn't just what happened. It's what we choose to remember. So today, we remember Africa, not as a victim of history, but as a maker of it. Not as background noise, but as a symphony of intellect, courage, and civilization. The maps have always lied. They placed Africa at the edge. The silence is ending. The center is calling. And now, we return to that center. She's been called a seductress, a lover of emperors, a tragic beauty wrapped in silk and scandal. But history lied, and Hollywood helped. It made brilliance look like beauty, and power look like perfume. Cleopatra was not a fantasy. She was a force of language, science, strategy, and statecraft. Before she was reduced to perfume and passion, she was the sovereign of the Nile, a ruler who spoke over 7 languages, commanded fleets, negotiated with Rome, mastered astronomy, and governed one of the richest territories in the ancient world. They wanted you to remember her eyeliner. We remember her intellect. Born in 69 BCE, Cleopatra VII Philopator was the last active ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty, a line that began with Ptolemy I, a general of Alexander the Great. Yes, her ancestry included Macedonian Greek blood, but to stop there is lazy and political. By the time Cleopatra rose to power, her family had ruled Egypt for nearly 300 years. They had intermarried, integrated, and governed a kingdom rooted in African cosmology, agriculture, and trade. And Cleopatra herself, unlike her predecessors, learned the Egyptian language fluently. She was the first in her line to do so. She embraced the spiritual codes of Isis. She consulted with astronomer priests. She rebuilt temples not just as monuments, but as engines of legitimacy, tying her rule to both divine science and divine bloodline. And she didn't wait for Rome. She challenged it. She wasn't a pawn of Julius Caesar. She wasn't a pet of Mark Antony. She was a co-strategist, commanding alliances, defending borders, manipulating grain prices across the Mediterranean, and leveraging Egypt's intellectual and economic power to keep Rome dependent. She played the empire until it turned. The real campaign against Cleopatra wasn't waged in battle. It was waged in story. After her death in 30 BCE, Rome needed to justify its conquest. Octavian, later Augustus, launched one of the most effective propaganda operations in human history. He branded Cleopatra a temptress, a foreign devil, a threat to Roman virtue. He wasn't fighting a woman. He was fighting an idea that a black bordering queen, a scientific mind, a female ruler could outwit the empire. The smear stuck. Writers like Plutarch and Cassius Dio, writing decades and centuries later, echoed the narrative. Shakespeare dramatized it. Painters eroticized it. Hollywood sanitized it. From Elizabeth Taylor's pale face to HBO's imperial lens, Cleopatra became whitewashed twice, once by skin, once by silence. But the record remains. Plutarch himself noted Cleopatra's intelligence, not her beauty, as her defining trait. She held court with philosophers and generals. She wrote medical treatises. She studied planetary motion with scholars trained in African and Hellenistic traditions. She governed a kingdom whose libraries rivaled Alexandria, whose temples were aligned with solar patterns, whose Nile records informed agriculture from Ethiopia to the Delta. Cleopatra was not the last gasp of Egypt. She was its final spark, resisting erasure with everything she had. And yet, she is one of the most rebranded figures in world history. Why? Because Cleopatra was inconvenient, too complex to romanticize, too brilliant to ignore, too African to accept, without a costume. Modern science has tried to reclaim her. In 2009, British archaeologist Kathleen Martinez uncovered evidence of Cleopatra's African lineage through Temple Taposiris Magna, where coinage and iconography linked her to both Isis and traditional Egyptian symbols. In 2023, scholar Islam Issa, in Al Jazeera's Landmark series, broke down the impossibility of assigning Cleopatra a single racial identity, affirming instead her deep cultural and spiritual immersion in the Nile's African world. And yet, the backlash came swift. When Netflix cast a black actress in a Cleopatra documentary, outrage erupted, not because it was historically false, but because it was politically uncomfortable. But the truth is not about skin tone alone. It is about sovereignty. Cleopatra's erasure was not just racial, it was intellectual. She was a woman of African soil with access to millennia of science, who used that wisdom to challenge an empire. And for that, she had to be reimagined, as small, as exotic, as emotional. They couldn't erase her name, so they erased her mind, but not her memory. Because history doesn't belong to propaganda, it belongs to evidence. And the evidence speaks clearly. Cleopatra was not the West's fantasy. She was Africa's final pharaoh. She stood at the edge of empire as the tide of colonization began. She stood with scrolls, with charts, with taxes, with treaties. She stood, not for romance, but for resistance. And in her fall, something else began. The war against African genius. The idea that African women could lead nations. That African priests could measure the stars. That African knowledge could defy Rome. This is why she matters. Not because she died dramatically, but because she lived intelligently. Because her story is not one of seduction, but of sovereignty. Not one of conquest, but of continuity. When they shattered her statues and broke the noses of queens carved in black stone, they weren't just defacing images. They were defacing memory. And yet, the memory survives. In papyri and pillars, in calendars aligned with Sirius, in temples designed with solar logic, in fragments of scripts she once read and reforms she once wrote. Cleopatra was not the end of something. She was the evidence of everything that came before. And beyond the Nile, her legacy would sail again, westward. Before Columbus ever touched a sail, before Spain claimed the seas, before 1492 became a classroom chant, a black emperor gave up a throne to chase the horizon. His name was Abu Bakr II, known in some records as Mansa Muhammad. He was the ruler of Mali, one of the wealthiest and most advanced empires of the 14th century. But he wanted more than gold. He wanted answers. In the year 1311, he abdicated his throne, not in disgrace, but by design. He handed power to his brother, Mansa Musa, and he set out across the Atlantic with a fleet of 2,000 ships. That's not legend. That's al-Umari, a respected Arab historian, writing in 1337. In his accounts, Mansa Musa, now emperor, tells of the expedition plainly. My predecessor did not believe the ocean's end could not be reached. So he built 2,000 boats. He took men, water, and provisions enough for years. Only one ship returned. The rest sailed on. This is not fantasy. It is recorded diplomacy. Musa told this story while visiting Cairo on his famed Hajj, a trip that stunned the Islamic world with his wealth and intellect. And Musa, devout as he was, never mocked his brother's journey. He honored it. So what kind of man gives up an empire to sail into the unknown? A scientist? A navigator? A visionary? Let's be clear, Abu Bakr II did not sail blind. From the port city of Niani to the riverbanks of the Senegal and Gambia, Mali had access to some of the most important hydrological and navigational data in the world. They understood currents. They tracked tides. They read stars, not as mystics, but as astronomers trained through centuries of Nile to Sahel knowledge systems. And there's a current, the Canary Current, that flows directly from West Africa to the Americas. Not metaphorically, literally. Modern oceanography confirms a vessel launched from the coast of Senegal, caught in the Canary Current and powered by prevailing trade winds, would land in Brazil or the Caribbean within weeks. Abu Bakr knew the sea had a rhythm. He followed it, not out of madness, but of method. His ships were not small dugouts. Malian maritime technology included long, plank-built canoes with multiple sails, rudders, and storage compartments. West African boatmakers mastered sewn plank techniques, the same technology found in Egyptian Nile ships and echoed in Phoenician and Arab designs. They built vessels not only for rivers, but for open ocean. How do we know? Because remnants of similar design have been found along West Africa's coastal settlements. And because the logic of such a fleet, carrying food, water, scholars, sailors, oarsmen, griots, was not mystical, it was logistical. 2,000 ships, half carrying supplies. The other half, people, tools, maps, ideas. This was not a journey of conquest. It was a voyage of inquiry, and maybe of return. Because something remarkable happens when we look across the Atlantic, especially at pre-Columbian Brazil, the Gulf of Mexico, and the Amazon basin. There are signs. In the state of Paraíba, Brazil, a stone inscription was found in the 1980s. Some say it shows West African Mande script. Skeptics deny it. Others see possibility. In the Gulf region, Olmec heads, massive basalt sculptures dating back centuries before Columbus. Bare facial features many identify as African. No, they are not conclusive. But they provoke the question. Cultural anthropologist Ivan van Sertima, in his book They Came Before Columbus, 1976, compiled dozens of such clues. Pre-Columbian African cottons in Mesoamerica, similar boat-building patterns, linguistic crossovers in root words, botanical evidence of West African flora in Brazil before 1500. Academia remains cautious, and it should. But caution is not erasure. Evidence deserves attention, not dismissal. And the clearest evidence is this. The journey was possible. Technologically, geographically, culturally. Abu Bakr II disappears from the records after 1311. No tomb, no return, no final word. But absence is not failure, and mystery is not myth. Because long before Columbus charted the seas, Mali had launched into them. Not for conquest, but for curiosity. Imagine what it means, for history, for science, for the soul, to realize that a West African emperor surrendered an empire to explore. No statues, no coins, just wind, water, and will. Even Mansa Musa, the richest man who ever lived, knew he was walking in his brother's wake. And that changes everything. Because if Abu Bakr reached the Americas, even one ship, even one sailor, then Africa did not wait for the world. Africa reached out to it. And if he didn't, then he still dared, with intellect, with infrastructure, with intention. And that matters more than myth. They told you the age of exploration began in Europe. They were wrong. It began with a black emperor who looked west and let go of power to follow the stars. And through those stars, his story still sails. They say, show the receipts. We brought them, and they've been waiting for centuries. In the vaults of the Sahara, buried beneath sand and time, over 700,000 manuscripts remain, handwritten in Arabic, Ajami, and local African scripts. They come from Timbuktu, Jenne, Gao, Chinguetti, cities that once thrived not as myths, but as intellectual powerhouses. These are not fables. They are footnotes, formulas, contracts, and codes. They cover astronomy, medicine, jurisprudence, commerce, ethics, and poetry. Many written centuries before the first printing press in Europe. The Timbuktu Manuscripts, now partially preserved in digital archives, include star charts used to calculate lunar cycles, medical treatises on cataracts and childbirth, and trade records tracking salt, gold, and knowledge across the Sahel. Some manuscripts record classroom debates, professors grading each other's arguments in margins. Others show correspondence between scholars from Egypt, Andalusia, and Mali, exchanging ideas on theology, law, and natural sciences. They prove this much. Africa did not borrow civilization. Africa authored its own, and it wasn't just texts. In 1375, over a century before Columbus set sail, the Catalan Atlas was created by Abraham Cresques, a Majorcan Jewish cartographer. One of its most striking panels, a depiction of Mansa Musa seated on a golden throne in West Africa, holding a nugget of gold the size of his palm. The caption reads, "This black ruler is called Musa Meli. The richest and most noble king. Why would a European cartographer place a Malian emperor, not a European pope, at the visual center of the known world? Because power was acknowledged. Because knowledge was respected. Because African sovereignty at that moment could not be denied." Today, that same Catalan Atlas is housed in the French National Library, but it rarely appears in classrooms. Let's go further. In the Book of Roger by al-Idrisi, completed in 1154, we find maps that show the West African coast in stunning accuracy, centuries before Western navigators had reliable charts. Arabic-speaking cartographers, many trained in African and Andalusian schools, sketched coastlines with directional currents, estuaries, and trade hubs. They didn't believe in sea monsters. They believed in wind. And when we move from maps to matter, the proof doesn't disappear. Archaeologists have uncovered pre-Columbian African beads in parts of the Amazon basin. Radiocarbon dating of certain cotton strains in Mesoamerica shows genetic similarity to West African plants. Even the metallurgy of early bronze in Benin bears resemblance to alloys later found in early Columbian artifacts. Are these definitive? Number. Are they probable? Increasingly. Are they worth ignoring? Absolutely not. So let's break it down. What we know is this. Africa housed full university systems before the West: Sankore, Timbuktu, al-Qarawiyyin in Fes. Mali's emperors built global trade networks, diplomatic embassies, and launched sea voyages, as recorded by al-Umari in 1337. The Catalan Atlas depicts Musa with textual reverence. Manuscripts in Timbuktu date from the 11th to the 16th centuries and include original scientific thought. What is likely? That some African navigators reached the Americas before 1492 via the Canary Current. That African crops, techniques, and words diffused into pre-Columbian societies. That early contact influenced local metallurgy, textiles, and navigation. What is still debated? The meaning of certain stone inscriptions in Brazil. The origin of Olmec head features. The precise genetic transfer between African and American plant species. And this is how real history works. Not in myths, not in denial, but in patterns, of data, of geography, of possibility. The mistake of Eurocentric history is not that it lacked proof, it refused to look. It dismissed African sources as myth, even when written in Arabic script. It called manuscripts primitive because they came from mud brick libraries, not marble palaces. It ignored trade routes that stretched 4,000 miles across deserts, routes more stable than many medieval roads in Europe. Even today, most of the Timbuktu manuscripts remain untranslated, stored in trunks, hidden in homes. Some were smuggled during civil war, others were burned by extremists, and yet, they survive. They survive in satellite scans. They survive in coded rhythms passed through griots. They survive in digital vaults hosted in South Africa, Norway, and the United States. They survive in the margins, both literal and historical. History was not lost. It was buried, under dust, under denial, under the weight of empire. But dust is not destruction. Dust is delay. And as we brush it off, the picture sharpens. Africa wasn't waiting for discovery. It was busy documenting the stars, drafting trade contracts, charting coastlines, revising theological arguments, and, perhaps, mapping the Atlantic from the other side. So the next time someone asks for proof, we offer not one page, but thousands. Not one explorer, but generations. Because they lied to you. They told you Africa had no science, no maps, no clocks, no charts. But the receipts were always there. They didn't just rewrite history, they rewired it, removing Africa from the circuitry of memory. You were taught the lie, but they built the machine. This wasn't an accident, it was an algorithm. A system designed not just to hide African history, but to redefine what counts as history in the first place. It began with language. The term pre-colonial Africa appears in textbooks worldwide. But think about what it implies. That Africa's identity is defined by what came after Europe arrived. That its timeline begins when someone else sets foot on it. Europe never calls itself post-Roman. But Africa is pre-colonial? That's not neutral. That's narrative control. Then came the maps. Cartographers in the 15th and 16th centuries redrew the world, literally. The Mercator projection, created in 1569, distorted scale to favor Europe. It shrank Africa, visually, on classroom walls for centuries. A continent 11.7 million square miles, made to look manageable. The lie was spatial, so the erasure could feel small. Then came the textbooks. During the colonial era, European empires produced education systems designed not to illuminate Africa, but to justify its subjugation. British and French school books omitted Mali, Kush, Timbuktu, not by oversight, but by policy. In Nigeria, 1920s, curriculum described Africans as primitive but loyal. In Algeria, Textbooks taught children that Arabs brought civilization to the African void. Meanwhile, entire cities of learning, Jenne, Gao, Fes, vanished from the pages. Even today, millions of students learn about the Renaissance, without knowing that the libraries of Timbuktu existed during the same period, and often exceeded Europe in literacy and scholarly output. Then came the museums. Walk through any major European collection, and you'll find African artifacts. Behind glass, without names. Masks labeled ritual object. Sculptures stripped of date or dynasty. Entire empires reduced to tribes. Royal thrones displayed without context, as if made by anonymous hands. What isn't explained becomes exotic. What isn't named becomes forgotten. The British Museum holds over 90,000 African pieces. Only a fraction are displayed. Fewer still are attributed to specific civilizations, and even fewer are presented as equal to Greco-Roman works, despite being contemporaneous. Then came the cinema. In 1963, Cleopatra was played by Elizabeth Taylor. White-skinned, British accented, filmed in Rome. A queen of African soil, erased in 70 millimeters. In 2001, The Mummy Returns featured Egyptian ruins, but no Egyptians. In 2020, Brave New World named a futuristic city New Alexandria, but erased the real Alexandria, that once housed the largest library in the ancient world. Even documentaries weren't immune. Africa was filmed in sepia tones, narrated with condescension, presented not as a civilization, but as a setting. The image was clear. Africa was background, not protagonist. Wild, not wise. Spiritual, not scientific. Then came the silence. Scholars who challenged this were marginalized. Cheikh Anta Diop was dismissed for using carbon dating to prove African antiquity. Ivan van Sertima was mocked for suggesting transatlantic contact before Columbus. Modern archaeologists who studied African metallurgy or city planning were denied funding. Silence is a form of censorship, not by redaction, but by refusal. And the result? Entire generations grew up thinking Africa had no calendars, no architecture, no navigation, no mathematics. Even now, many academic journals still treat African science as ethnoscience, a separate category, as if Newton's gravity is physics. But African star maps are folklore. This is not erasure. This is epistemicide, the killing of knowledge. Because once you erase who created the knowledge, you control who inherits it. Let's be precise. They told you Cleopatra was Greek, but not that she aligned temples to Sirius. They told you Mali had gold, but not that it had maritime maps. They told you Africa had rhythm, but not that it had universities. They kept the image. They removed the intellect. Why? Because it's easier to colonize land after you've colonized the imagination. And it's easier to dominate bodies once you've dominated memory. This is not about guilt. This is about geometry. If Africa is placed at the bottom of the map, beneath the equator, beneath the gaze, beneath the curriculum, then everything else can be framed as above. But Africa was never beneath. It was buried, and the tools of burial were systemic. Maps that minimized, books that omitted, films that distorted, museums that mislabeled, classrooms that never questioned, and each one turned memory into machinery. This is not just about what they taught. It's about what they made invisible. And invisibility is powerful. You can't reclaim what you've never been told was yours. So they lied. They lied loudly. They lied legally. They lied institutionally. They lied artistically. They lied cartographically. But truth has weight, and buried things rise. We're not asking for pity. We're demanding proportion. We're not grieving nostalgia. We're resurrecting evidence. This is the engine they built, to erase. But here's the catch. It only runs if we stop remembering. They tried to erase a continent. But Africa is not data. Africa is memory, and memory fights back. After centuries of distortion, denial, and deletion, a new generation is rising. Not with weapons, but with evidence. Not with vengeance, but with restoration. Because you cannot delete a civilization if it remembers itself. Across Africa, across the diaspora, across the digital world, the silence is breaking. In the heart of Mali, hidden in tin boxes and family trunks, the Timbuktu Manuscripts are being rescued, page by page, verse by verse. During the 2012 insurgency, as militants advanced toward Timbuktu, librarians, truck drivers, teachers, and teenagers risked their lives to smuggle 377,000 manuscripts out of the city. They wrapped them in blankets, they hid them under bags of rice, they crossed checkpoints at night. Today, those documents are being digitized through initiatives led by Africans themselves, like Abdelkader Haidara and Savama DCI. Partners across Cape Town, Oslo, and Washington, D.C. support, but do not direct the work. Because this time, the knowledge won't be stolen. It will be shared on African terms. And it's not just manuscripts. In Ghana, scholars are rewriting curriculum to include Sankofa, not just as a word, but as a method. The act of going back to retrieve what was forgotten. In South Africa, the African Origins Platform uses genetics, archaeology, and oral tradition to rebuild the timeline of migration and innovation across the continent. In Kenya, students learn about ancient metallurgy alongside modern chemistry. In Nigeria, new textbooks center Ife, Nok, and Benin as artistic capitals, not tribal curiosities. And in universities across the diaspora, from Howard to SOAS, from Dakar to Bahia, a shift is happening. Professors teach that Cleopatra was more than a love interest, that Mali launched ships before Columbus. That knowledge is not Western by default, but the rally is not just academic, it's artistic. Painters now depict Mansa Musa not as legend, but as logistics. Photographers reimagine Timbuktu in color, not sepia. Filmmakers cast African scientists not as anomalies, but ancestors. In Brazil, musicians sample Mande rhythms into samba. In the US, spoken word artists resurrect griot cadence. In Senegal, fashion designers weave pre-colonial script into modern fabric. This is not nostalgia, this is narration, reclaimed, and the digital world is amplifying the call. Online archives now feature African empires with the same fidelity once reserved for Rome and Greece. Open-source courses teach African astronomy. Podcasts revisit African queens. Documentaries give Africa the voiceover, not just the backdrop. Even museums are being challenged. The British Museum, the Louvre, the Humboldt Forum. Protests now demand not only restitution, but re-narration. It's not enough to return the artifact. You must return the context. A throne without its story is not heritage, it's hostage. So curators are beginning to rewrite labels. Installations now name kings once erased. Virtual tours now follow timelines that center Africa's agency. It's slow, but it's shifting. And here's the most powerful part. This isn't coming from institutions alone. It's coming from you. Every time you question a textbook, every time you post an image of Sankore, every time you say Mansa Musa's name in full, you're part of the correction. History is not just what scholars say, it's what communities remember, because no empire survives if no one believes it. And no silence holds if someone breaks it. You don't need a PhD, you need curiosity. You need the courage to ask, why didn't I learn this? And the determination to teach it forward. This story does not belong to gatekeepers. It belongs to those who lived it, and those who choose to tell it. Now. We are in a moment, a turning point. Africa's history is no longer waiting. It's walking back onto the stage, manuscript in hand, scroll under arm, constellation overhead. This is more than repair. It's renaissance. A renaissance not just of facts, but of frameworks, of how we define intelligence, of how we value ancestors, of how we measure time, space, and progress. Because if Mali had astronomy, and Ethiopia had theology, and Nubia had geometry, then Africa did not contribute to civilization. Africa is civilization. And the journey to restore that isn't political, it's personal. Because every child deserves to know that their people were not lost. They were edited, and every edit can be reversed. So we rally, not with rage, but with resolve. We rally by restoring manuscripts, by renaming museum plaques, by rewriting curricula, by retelling stories in our voices, our tongues, our frames. We rally by remembering, because memory is a form of resistance. And when memory becomes collective, it becomes power. So join the scholars, join the artists, join the students, the mothers, the griots, the data analysts, the map makers, join the movement, join the reclamation, join the lineage, join the tribe, reclaim the story. They called Africa the dark continent. But darkness is not a place. It's a tactic. It's what happens when you turn off the lights, steal the map, and then hand the world a compass that always points away from Africa. But here's the truth. Africa is not behind. Africa is not beneath. Africa is not broken. Africa was edited, and now the red ink fades. Because when you trace the roots of science, of trade, of writing, of medicine, you keep landing in Africa, no matter where you start. For too long, they asked the wrong question. Can Africa catch up? Catch up to what? To who? You do not measure time by the clocks of your colonizers. You measure time by the stories you carry, by the futures you build. The future of history begins now, and Africa is not just included. Africa is centered. This is not a plea for inclusion. It is a return to authorship, a reclamation of narrative sovereignty. In classrooms, teachers are lifting the veil. In museums, curators are changing the labels. In archives, Black scholars are renaming the files, revisiting the footnotes, reclaiming the chapters that were torn out. In universities, students are no longer asking, was Africa capable? They're asking, how was Africa silenced? And that question changes everything. Because this is not a moment, it is a movement. Not just in Africa, but across the diaspora. In Jamaica, Ghanaian roots are retold through drum and dialect. In Brazil, Yoruba gods whisper through carnival and capoeira. In Harlem, Black artists are painting timelines back into walls, reclaiming what textbooks erased. In Kenya, digital historians are mapping forgotten kingdoms, layering oral traditions with AI, with satellite, with scan. In Nigeria, architects are fusing mud brick and fiber optics, not past versus future, but tradition as technology. This is not nostalgia. This is design. This is not pride. This is precision. Because the future isn't built from scratch. It's built from memory. And Africa remembers. Even now, in every field, Black excellence isn't waiting for permission. In agriculture, indigenous crops return to the soil, drought-resistant, nutrient-rich, time-tested. In physics, ancient Dogon cosmology aligns with NASA's star maps. In environmental science, African fire ecology is reshaping global climate strategies. In architecture, Nubian vaults are praised for sustainable cooling. In mathematics, Egypt's Rhind papyrus still teaches logic, not just legacy. They said Africa had no history, but Africa had calendars. Africa had constellations. Africa had city plans. It's not that Africa had no history. It's that Europe had no language to describe it, so it renamed it, then erased it, then replaced it. But what was removed can be restored. Because the lie was global, and so must be the correction. The globe itself must turn. The map must be redrawn. The museum must confess. The curriculum must unlearn. The algorithm must be retrained. This is not about guilt. It's about geometry. Who stands at the center of the circle? Who gets to draw the lines? Who is labeled ancient and who is called advanced? Who is measured? And who does the measuring? We now live in an age where knowledge is not given. It is gathered. And Africa is gathering. Across TikTok, YouTube, WhatsApp, and academic journals, a new map is emerging. A map not of nations, but of knowing. A map where Mali is more than a sidebar. Where Ethiopia is not just a famine. Where Nubia is not just a ruin. Where Kemet is not a myth, but a model. A map where students in Detroit and Dakar are decoding glyphs together. Where grandmothers in Soweto and Baltimore remember the same drumbeat. This is how Africa returns to the world stage, not as background, but as blueprint. Not as memory, but as mirror. Not as question mark, but as compass. Because the future will be shaped by those who remember what came before the distortion. The ones who dig through the ash to find the original lines. The ones who know Africa does not need discovery, it needs restoration. We don't just retell history, we restore it. With evidence, with clarity, with honor. And now, so do you. We don't just retell history, we restore it with evidence and honor.